When you were talking about your experience of looking at robots, it reminds me of how I, for many years, have been looking at plants. Because the plant behavior, and actually, this is the example. Maybe we'll just try it out. It
Hmm.
may not work.
Let's
This is an
go.
example I was thinking of recently because I was reading back on the work of Mark Jaffe, who did this research with pea tendrils. I'm sure he did many other plant studies, but this is the one I was reading about. And I'm hoping this analogy, I'll just set it up. I'm
Yeah.
hoping that this analogy will be something that we can keep coming back to as we move forward because, as we shake up our intuitions and get confused and then we come back to our intuitions and say, no, that just can't be. I think this analogy might be helpful. But
What kind of plant was he working on?
pea tendrils. So a
Okay.
pea plant has these tendrils. You can picture them. They coil.
Hmm.
So I don't know what year this research was done. I'm guessing in the 80s, but some
But pea tendrils have been around long before that.
yes, of course. and the research may have happened
In
long
fact, they
before the
might be
80s.
doing the research on the humans, but that's another story.
Yeah, right. Pea tendrils, as a system, generally, there are a few more things they can do, but generally they can behave in two ways. They can grow in a straight line slowly, or they can grow in this coil form more quickly. And what happens is when they are growing in a straight manner and they encounter a branch or a pole or something else that it can wrap itself around to gain more stability, when it senses a branch there, that gives it the cue to start growing at a more rapid pace and to start coiling instead of growing straight. So it has these two behaviors. As a system, it's capable of growing straight and it's capable of coiling. One interesting thing, actually, I'll just add this, it's not totally relevant, but one interesting thing is Mark Jaffe's work. So he cut a pea tendril. He was curious to see if it could do this on its own, separate from the rest of the plant. So he cut a pea tendril off the plant. If you keep it in a moist, warm environment, it will continue to behave in these ways. So it will continue to coil. If he noticed that if he touched one end of it, if he rubbed one side of it, that gave it enough of a cue that it would start to coil. And then he noticed that it needed light to perform this action. So in the dark, when he rubbed the edge of the tendril, it did not coil. In the light, it would. And then he recognized this further fact, which was that the pea tendril that he rubbed in the dark, that was still straight, if he brought it out into the light, and this could be hours later, it would start to coil.
Hmm.
It has a primitive form of memory where it's has the sensation and then it holds on to that information. And as soon as there's light, it acts on that
But
information.
also in a kind of distributed intelligence because you can separate it from the main part.
Right.
Like if you chop off a human arm, it's not gonna
Right.
keep growing.
Even if you keep it in a moist, warm environment, it's
In
not
the light.
going to reach out for the cup of coffee when you come in with Starbucks.
Or maybe in the correct environment. Maybe we just haven't found the environment. But anyway, that's pretty amazing.
So that's a separate fact. But anyway, so if you just use the analogy of a pea tendril, and if you imagine, which is something I like to do a lot, if you imagine this plant has some kind of conscious experience, of course, it doesn't have complex thought, it doesn't have anything like a human experience. But if it were possible for a plant to have some felt experience, you can imagine that when it comes into contact with a branch and starts to coil, that feeling could be one of deciding to do that, or that it feels good to do that, or kind of wanting. I mean, that's too complex. That's anthropomorphizing, but there's a way in which you could imagine this pea tendril under those circumstances suddenly wants to start coiling.
So you're saying you try to meditate on what it's like to be a pea tendril, a plant. Like that's what's required here. It's like you have to empathize with a plant or with another organism that's not human.
Yeah, and you don't actually need that for this analogy the larger analogy that I'm getting at, but I think that's an interesting piece to keep in mind, that you could imagine that in nature, if there's a conscious experience associated with a pea tendril, that at that moment, what that feels like is a want to start moving in a different way.
Right. So you want to imagine that without anthropomorphizing, so without projecting the human experience, but rather sort of humbling yourself that we're just another plant with more complexity.
Yes.
Like trying to see where...
Exactly. So that's where I'm going with this.
Sure.
So, and when you start making that connection, you can see where there are a few points at which there's room for an illusion to come in for our own feelings of will. So when we move from a P tendril to human decision making, obviously, human decision making, human brains are many, many, many times more complex than whatever is going on in a P tendril. I mean, it is, the brain is actually the most complex thing we know of in the universe thus far. So there is the genes that help develop the brain into any particular brain into what it is. There are all the inputs. There are countless factors that we could never, I mean, it may as well be an infinite number of factors. And then in that particular moment, whatever the inputs are to a brain, the brain is capable of almost an infinite number of outputs, right? So if I walked in here this morning and you said, would you like water or tea? And that's, simple
I think
decision for
that's
me
a
to make.
passive aggressive way of telling me I should have offered you some tea. But
That's
yes,
funny.
go on.
No, I wanted water.
Okay. All right.
I actually asked for water.
Okay. All right,
You're
great.
good. And you didn't have any free will anyway, so it doesn't matter. I don't hold you responsible for any of it.
Exactly. I was just
Um,
running an algorithm
so
deterministically.
you
Anyway.
give me this decision, right, to make
Yes.
water or tea. Go back to the P tendril for a second. A P tendril is capable of growing in a straight line slowly or in a coil
Mhm.
quickly. My brain is capable of all kinds of responses to that question. Even though you've given me, two options, you could offer me water or tea, and I could just run out of the room screaming if I wanted to. Right?
Happens to me all the time on dates.
Say, never mind. I don't want to do this.
Yes.
The fact that the brain is capable,
Yeah.
that there's so many inputs, and then the brain is capable of so many outputs as a system. What it's hard for us to get our minds around is that it may not be capable of any behavior in every moment in time. So as a system, it's capable of doing all kinds of things. And the point I'm making is that if we could see all of the factors leading up to the moment where I chose water or where I ran screaming from the room, we could, in fact, see that there was no other behavior I was going to or could have exhibited in that moment. In the same way that when the P tendril hits the branch, it starts coiling.
There's a parallel which is very interesting in robotics with fish and water. So you could see they've experiments with like dead fish and they keep swimming. So the fish is capable of all kinds of complicated movements as a system. But in any one moment, the river, the full complexity of the river defines the actual movement of the fish. And then
Right.
what's efficient?
Well, and I should also, I mean, this brings up another point, which is that there is a difference between voluntary and involuntary behavior. So, of course, we have reflexes, and it is there's different brain processing in action when I make a decision about water or tea than there is, if my behavior is forced from the outside, or if I have a brain tumor that's causing me to make certain decisions or feel certain feelings. And so the point is that at bottom, it's all brain processing and behavior. But the reason why certain actions feel willed, there's a good reason why it feels that way. And it's to distinguish our own self-generated behavior based on thinking and possibly weighing the different results of different things. I already had caffeine today. I don't want more. There are all these processes, things that we can point to and things that we can't, things I'm affected by at a subconscious level. And that is very different from an unwilled action or a reflex or something like that. And so some people, I can imagine, I haven't used the P tendril example, but I can imagine they wouldn't like that because the P tendril sounds more to them like a reflex, and that doesn't address the question of a much more complex decision-making process. But I think at bottom, that is what it is. And that's really where the illusion of free will and the illusion of self, which I think they're kind of two sides of the same coin, come from. So even when we intellectually understand that everything we're feeling, everything we're doing is based on our brain processing and brain behavior. If you're a physicalist, you've bought into that. Um, Even when you intellectually understand that, and I include myself in this, we still have this feeling that there's something that stands outside of the brain processing that can intervene. And
Mhm.
that's the illusion.